Brought to you by PrayLatin.com, makers of prayer cards featuring complete English phonetic renderings of Latin pronunciations.
Padre Pio is an enigmatic figure in the life of the Church. There's a lot of myths around him, a lot of false prophecies attributed to him. I admit that early on in my channel I recorded one of them and put them up here, and I've left it up there at the suggestion of people, not to keep getting clicks on it, but just for transparency's sake. But when it comes to things alleged to have been said by Padre Pio, it generally is a good idea to stick with primary sources or from people who knew him really well, who have an irreproachable reputation, such as today. Padre Pio was said to have been given the third secret of Fatima before the seers at Fatima, 4 years before them. And the source of that information is the late Father Gabriel Amorth, who was the Vatican's chief exorcist. He knew Padre Pio in life, and he gave an interview a few years before his own passing where he revealed essentially what the crux of the third secret of Fatima is. The crux of it, which differs greatly from what was given to us in 2000, which should not surprise anybody because the people responsible for giving that third secret, the cardinals responsible for it, were not the most trustworthy people. But the crux of the third secret of Fatima was that Satan would enter into the bosom of the Church, and that an anti-pope would come to rule a false church. Not saying that's where we are now. In fact, I caution people to not believe that necessarily we are there now. I do think we're well on the road there, though, if we're not there already. And the reason I caution people about that is because, as hard as this may be for some to hear, we can get worse popes than Francis. There are mystics who have warned of a time during a crisis in the Church that sounds suspiciously like what we're living through now, that there would be a time when there would be at least 2 consecutive anti-popes who would rule the Church and who would impose a false church. 2 consecutive anti-popes. I'm not saying necessarily that Francis is an anti-pope, but he does a very good job of making people think he is one. It can get worse than Francis. Much worse. But with all that said, the following is what was related to by Father Gabriel Amorth to an interviewer more than a decade ago, as compiled by Dr. Mike Hickson for 1 Peter 5 several years ago, and her research is also unimpeachable. So here is the crux of that interview, and I think you will find this very interesting because it also relates to the question of the validity of the consecration as done by John Paul II in 1984, which Sister Lucia is reported to have said was accepted by heaven. Except when you find out how that was communicated, you find out that also the same people who were completely untrustworthy just waved a piece of paper in front of people and said, "Here is the proof. No, I won't show it to you. Just take my word for it." Sister Lucia, who can't speak for herself anymore, is the one who said this, even though the person who said that, the Cardinal Bertone, is not exactly the most trustworthy figure either. He would be quite at home in the Bergoglian Church today. And here is Father Gabriel Amorth on Padre Pio, the consecration of that country, as requested by Our Lady at Fatima, in the crux of the third secret at Fatima. The following is verbatim from an article Dr. Hickson wrote for 1 Peter 5 back in May of 2017. It details a conversation between Father Amorth and the interviewer, where we hear that Father Amorth testifies that Padre Pio revealed the third secret of Fatima. A piece of the Fatima puzzle came in the form of an interview with the very famous and now deceased Roman exorcist, Father Gabriel Amorth, also conducted by Jose Maria Zavala. Father Amorth personally knew St. Pio for 26 years, and it is from this towering figure of 20th century Catholic sanctity that he claims to have learned the contents of the third secret of Fatima. Father Amorth was interviewed by Zavala in 2011, who kept the interview secret until the exorcist's death, publishing it for the first time in his book about Fatima. In the interview, Father Amorth relates, as he has done elsewhere, that he does not believe the consecration of the world by Pope John Paul II in 1984 was sufficient to satisfy the requirements set forth by Our Lady. There was no such consecration then, He, Father Amorth, says, I witnessed the act. I was in St. Peter's Square that Sunday afternoon, very close to the Pope. So close, I could almost touch him. Pressed by Zavala as to why he so forcefully believes that the consecration was not done, Father Amorth replied, very simple. John Paul II wanted to mention that country that's required in the consecration expressly, but in the end, he did not. Zavala pressed the issue with Father Amorth, saying that Sister Lucia herself, as mentioned above, had said that heaven had accepted the consecration. He describes an incredulous reaction from Father Amorth. Lucia said that? He asked. Zavala continues. Well, Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone said it in the year 2000, hiding behind a letter from Lucia dated November 1989 in which she stated heaven had admitted the consecration in spite of one of the most important conditions. Have you seen that letter? He, Father Amorth, asks, as if conducting a police interrogation in search of evidence. Never, I say flatly. I do not think you'll ever see it because I'm convinced that Lucia did not write it. How are you so sure of that? Why didn't Bertone show it when he should have, when he announced the third secret of Fatima? A simple photocopy of the manuscript included in the official dossier of the Vatican would have been sufficient to dispel any doubt. If the Vatican has always been scrupulous in providing the documentary proof that authenticated the information by Lucia on minor matters, what reason would they have to skimp on the only documentary evidence that, according to Bertone, validated a fact that without doubt was of as much importance as a consecration performed by John Paul II? Yes, it is weird, I admit. You really think that Lucia took 5 years to write that the consecration had been truly accepted, and that Bertone waited no less than 16 years to announce the validity of something so crucial as the consecration of that country requested by Our Lady to the Immaculate Heart of Mary? Father Amorth's voice sounded like dry leaves. It's all very strange in truth. I, Zavala, nod again. Moreover, he adds, if the consecration of the world to the Immaculate Heart of Mary made by Pius XII in 1942 was only partially accepted, because he did not specifically mention the country requested, for Jesus said that in view of it the war would only be shortened rather than finished immediately, why would he now change his mind with John Paul II if that country was not mentioned on this occasion? It would be an incongruity, yes. Rather. So, I have no doubt that the consecration did not occur on the terms requested by the Virgin, but we must not lose sight of what she herself wanted to tell us through Lucia. In the end, my Immaculate Heart will triumph. The Holy Father will consecrate that country to me, and it will come to be, thereby granting itself to the world a time of peace. The interview digresses here from the topic of Fatima, but Zavala returns to it again later. Forgive me for insisting on the third secret of Fatima. Did Padre Pio relate it, then, to the loss of faith within the Church? Father Gabriel furrows his brow and sticks out his chin. He seems very affected. Indeed, he states, one day Padre Pio said to me very sorrowfully, You know, Gabriel, it is Satan who has been introduced into the bosom of the Church, and within a very short time will come to rule a false church. Then the interviewer exclaims in a way that some would think is taking the Lord's name in vain, and says, Some kind of Antichrist. When did he prophesy this to you? I, Zavala, ask. It must have been about 1960, since I was already a priest then. Was that why John the 23rd had such a panic about publishing the third secret of Fatima, so that people wouldn't think that he was the anti-pope or whatever it was? A slight but knowing smile curls the lips of Father Amorth. Did Padre Pio say anything else to you about future catastrophes? Earthquakes, floods, wars, pestilences, hunger? Did he allude to the same plagues prophesied in the Holy Scripture? Nothing of the sort mattered to him, however terrifying they proved to be, except for the great apostasy within the Church. This was the issue that really tormented him, and for which he prayed and offered a great part of his suffering, crucified out of love. The third secret of Fatima? Exactly. Is there any way to avoid something so terrible, Father Gabriel? There is hope, but it's useless if not accompanied by works. Let us begin by consecrating that country to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Let us recite the Holy Rosary. Let us all do prayer and penance. Later, Father Gabriel Amorth was quoted as having said the following in 2015. The consecration has not yet been made. I was there on March 25th of 1984 in St. Peter's Square. I was in the front row, practically within touching distance of the Holy Father. Pope John Paul II wanted to consecrate that country, but his entourage did not, fearing that the Orthodox would be antagonized, and they almost thwarted him. Therefore, when His Holiness consecrated the world on his knees, he added a sentence not included in the distributed version, that instead said to consecrate, quote, especially those nations of which you yourself have asked for their consecration. So indirectly, that included that country. However, a specific consecration has not yet been made. You can always do it. Indeed, it will certainly be done. End quote. For some people, that's hard to hear because they want to believe that the consecration was done in 1984 or more recently in 2020. If that was the case, we would have seen the effect of it by now. The world is not in a better place since 1984. There has not been the reign of the Immaculate Heart. The triumph of the Immaculate Heart has not happened since 1984. The world is objectively in a worse place than it was in 1984. Francis's attempted consecration, where he named the country explicitly, the first one to do it, but he also named other countries. And a simple reading of the request says to name that country, no others. Some may nitpick at that or think I'm nitpicking, but the fruits at this point speak for themselves. Something is wrong. Something is terribly wrong. And when that consecration was done, I said, look, I came onto this channel and I told people, give it some time, you will know, because Sister Lucia herself, back in like the 50s, said that when the consecration was done, you would see the effect immediately. At least 4 years later now, what has the effect been? Things are worse than they have ever been. And I did suggest to people that would give you some uncomfortable questions to have to start asking yourself, including maybe about Francis himself. I'll leave you to decide that. That is an issue of your own conscience to have to deal with. But I'm curious, what do you think about what Father Gabriel Amorth here said about Padre Pio? Do you believe Padre Pio was given the third secret? Do you believe that he was given insight and that the allegation that Satan would come to fall a false church by infiltrating the Catholic Church seems to be playing out before our eyes? Curious what you have to say about that in the comments, please. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It certainly helps. So does sharing this on social media. That helps too. And as always, pray for the Church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.